Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel. And tonight we are in part two of our look at Christmas through the ages. Now, if you think back to last night's video, we looked at pre-Christian times, in other words, winter solstice, the festival of Saturnalia, and also the festival of Yule. And that's just really talking about three winter festivals. And there is, if you look at it, quite a few winter festivals, not just those three. I only mentioned those three as being the main ones, basically. But eventually we get Christianity come along, and Christianity needs to disperse, to get rid, and to hide our pagan ancestry. So when Christianity comes along, they actually look at winter festivals, including the ones that I've mentioned, and they start to think, well, how can we have a winter festival that covers all those up but also uses them? And the reason I say that is if you think about churches, for example, churches have an altar. Well, really that stems back to pagan sacrificial altars, except now they're covered in cloth, they have crosses and candles on them. And that's the same with a lot of the festivals. If you think of the festival of Eostre, for example, that becomes Easter. And very simply, by the Middle Ages, they're looking at all these pagan festivals and they create what we now call Christmas. Now, the earlier spelling looked a little bit different. So there is a very early spelling, a medieval spelling for Christmas. And as you can see, it's Christ Mass is basically the English translation of that one. And here we have our modern version of that medieval word, so Christ Mass. And that's exactly what it's all about, because it was the Pope in the medieval period. And remember, we're all Catholics in this country, predominantly Catholic, that is. And therefore, the Pope is who we take our orders from, as well as the King. And the Pope actually did a few calculations. He looked at pagan winter festivals. He looked at the moon and the sun, for example. And he actually calculated that Christmas should fall on the 25th of December. So he actually puts a date that Christ was born on the 25th of December. And it's quite interesting because prior to that, there was no knowledge. And the simple thing is, even if you look through the Bible, even today, a modern Bible, you won't find the date for the birth of Christ. There's not many dates in the Bible, but the 25th of December was calculated by the Pope, and we followed it basically. When the church is very powerful and they say the 25th of December is now Christmas, then we have to follow it. So when we get to the Middle Ages, we get the birth of our Christian celebration of the birth of Christ, Christmas, Christmas. So in the medieval period, what did we actually do? Well, very simple. It wasn't a long drawn out affair like it is today. It doesn't start, for example, in August bank holiday or in September. It actually started on the 25th of December. And famously, it was calculated that the festivities should run for exactly 12 days, famously the 12 days of Christmas, which actually takes us up to January and technically the end of Christmas with Twelfth Night, which was actually a very big celebration years ago. Some people say actually bigger than Christmas itself. So it was a very short-lived period, but people prepared for it. They didn't prepare for it in August, but they prepared for it very close to the day, Christmas Eve, for example. And that usually meant, first of all, decorating their homes. And what did they use? Well, very simple. They used what our pagan ancestors used: plants that defy winter, plants that are alive when everything else is dead, basically. So people went out and they brought in famously things like holly, ivy and mistletoe. Now, mistletoe was originally a fertility symbol, as I mentioned in the last video. Well, that was brought in. It looks nice. It defies winter. Same with ivy. Ivy is actually very, very good because you can use that to plait everything together to make these big, long strips of greenery. And then the interesting thing about holly is there was a story that said if you look at the spiky leaves, that represents the crown of thorns. And people also stated that the berries on holly were all white until the blood of Christ dripped on them, changing them all blood red. So you can see how Christianity are tweaking earlier pagan ideas and making it their own. And that is what I always say about Christmas. We have cherry picked, we have picked and chosen the bits we like and thrown away the bits we don't like. We don't like human sacrifice, so we don't do that, as far as I'm aware. But we do like the idea of decorating our home. So they brought all that greenery in and they hung it around their home. Some people would have even brought in a Yule log, and we know in the Lord's feasting hall or banqueting hall, for example, the Yule log was dragged in with great ceremony, with minstrels and players and dancers, and that famously was said to burn not just for the whole of the festivities, but specifically for the 12 days of Christmas, that period when Christ is born, right up to the wise men turning up at the manger or the nativity scene. So it's a famous 12 days of Christmas. But medieval people loved a good feast, a good banquet. So in the Middle Ages, after attending Christ Mass, it was then normal to go and feast. If you live in a small house, a peasant house, for example, you would all come together and try and eat a hearty and good quality meal. And you have to remember, the run up to Christmas, Advent as we would call it, was a non-meat period. It was a fasting period. So people were eating fish, they were eating vegetables. But when it come to Christmas Day, for example, even the peasants tried to get a little bit of meat. It was quite a celebration, actually. Those in the Lord's feasting hall, for example, as the Yule log was burning away and the fine decorations of greenery was in the air, they would have a very big banquet, and we're talking, let's say, 26 courses. And a bit of advice, if you go back through the playlist, have a look at Dining Like a Lord, because they knew how to eat in the Middle Ages, and they would have all sorts of things. If you were someone very, very important, royalty, for example, you could have things like sturgeon, you would have things like swan and peacock. And remember, these are foods that were cooked and then the skins wrapped around them. They were never plucked, they were skinned, the meat cooked, and then the actual skin with the feathers wrapped around them. So these animals, like the swan and peacock, looked alive still. And there was also something called the cockentrice, which was basically where you take a cockerel, a large cockerel, and you would sew it to the back end of a suckling pig, a baby pig, and it sort of looks like a dragon, basically, and that's what the Lord of the Manor would say. And then famously, when it came to the great feast, as well as having all the entertainment, the musicians and so on, the big thing was the bringing in of the boar's head. And even though I haven't got the boar's head here this evening, we do have one along with all this other food, fake food, by the way, that we use whenever we do a talk or whenever we do a living history setup as a Christmas banqueting scene, for example. There was even a carol that was sang when the boar's head was brought in, and the boar's head sat on the top table looking down at everyone else, basically. After 26, 27 courses, or removes as they called them, you would be in there for a very, very long time. And then it would come to the entertainment, the main part of the entertainment. That would include the mummers play, which is another word for the masked play. Now, at the start of the Middle Ages, these plays were very religious, so they were usually the story of the life of Christ, for example. But by the 15th and definitely into the 16th century, they had become farcical plays, is the best way of putting it, really. Lots of drunkenness, lots of throwing things around, and generally misbehaving, which is one of the reasons why later on in history you do get the pantomime. And like I said, we cherry pick our Christmases. We like some of the things and we get rid of the things that we don't like. Sometimes there was also the choosing of the Lord of Misrule, and this was a person that was chosen for the night who was technically in charge of a make-believe world known as the topsy-turvy world, and his job would be to play tricks on people and get everyone laughing, get everyone jalling together. The Lord of Misrule of the topsy-turvy world. And obviously there would be storytelling as well. You'd have stories of St. George and the Dragon, or my favourite story, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and that's a video in its own right, really. And then by the end of the evening, on the evening of Christmas Day, it was normal to then hand out charity, and what that would consist of is maybe the bread that was cut into squares to eat food on, that was softened up by the food. And remember, this is stale bread. That was usually given out to the poor at the manor gate, for example. And the poor would love that because it would have the meat juices on and so on. And then the other thing is they would often make these pies made out of all the bits that the top table didn't want of, for example, the deer if they had venison. In those items, those what we would call offal really, that went into these pies were often referred to as the umbles, which is why we get the saying eating humble pie, originally called umble pie, the scraps from the top table. And then the days after, for example, Boxing Day, in the subsequent days up to Twelfth Night, would be further parties, further charity work, further feasting, for example. It was a fun old time, and this continued not just in the Middle Ages under the banner of Christianity. This also continued into the 16th century, into the period of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. But sadly, by the 1600s, by the 17th century, there was a lot of political organisations. And if you look through our playlist, for example, to the one we did on the Mayflower, I mention a lot of the organisations that appear in the 17th century. We have, for example, the Quakers, the Ranters, the Levellers. We have many organisations. And one of the powerful ones was actually the group known as the Puritans. And the Puritans, obviously, by the 17th century, were very annoyed with this new Church of England, which, after all, was created by Henry VIII. And they actually thought this Church of England was very papist. In other words, it was very Catholic. Even the word Christ Mass, Christmas, sounded Catholic. It had the word Mass in it. So the Puritans began to draw up a complaint, and this is part of the leaflet from 1646. So by the time Worcester was being besieged, for example, during the English Civil War, the Puritans had actually created this complaint of Christmas, and there were several complaints that they had. They said, for example, the 25th of December was a date that was made up as such, really. It wasn't a date that was written down or penned in the Bible, for example. So that was wrong to start with. They also thought hanging up holly, ivy and mistletoe was pagan. It was very much what our ancestors did when they had, for example, winter solstice or the Saturnalia festival or the festival of Yule. And they obviously hated the idea of the Yule log, and they thought feasting and eating vast quantities of food at Christmas was a bad thing. We should have purer lives, more basic lives. And famously, the Puritans were very well known for that. They also believed that the mummers play, wearing animal masks, for example, running about in a way making a mockery of the Bible stories, was wrong, and it was very anti-Christian, very anti-Puritan. So all these things were being put down into the complaint of Christmas, and these leaflets, these pamphlets went absolutely everywhere, basically. And then in the end, the Puritans, that are becoming the most powerful organisation, especially within the Parliament Army, eventually brings in a ban on Christmas. Yes, you heard me right. Believe it or not, even though I mentioned Christmases have been around for a very, very long time, including pre-Christian, unfortunately, the Puritans did not like the way Christmas was. They thought it was pagan. They thought it was too much joyfulness, and they banned it. And famously, in the 17th century, there is no Christmas. Now, one thing I will add at this point, Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, the victor of the Battle of Worcester, he did not personally ban Christmas. I know it's a shocking thing to say, but most people always say Cromwell banned Christmas. You are very wrong. The Puritans were the ones that banned Christmas. And yes, Oliver Cromwell was a Puritan. But deep down, it wasn't Oliver Cromwell that banned it on his own. It was the Puritans. We do actually know that Oliver Cromwell did have a few feasts during the Christmas period, even though you were not meant to. But the Puritans made sure that you were not allowed to eat vast amounts of food. If you were caught with a plum pudding, for example, a very exotic pudding, the forerunner of the Christmas pudding that we all know, you could be arrested for it. If you were caught hanging holly, ivy and mistletoe, you would be imprisoned or fined for it. And even just saying wassail or Merry Christmas to someone, that would also get you fined or imprisoned. It was now against the law to have Christmas. Even shops were meant to open. If it was on a Sunday, that's a different matter. But the Puritans said if Christmas was on any other day, a Monday, Tuesday or whatever, shops must open. Christmas has been banned. So as I always say, when Christianity comes along, we have a fantastic Christmas. The decorations, the feasting, the merrymaking, the charity. But then sadly, the Puritans don't like it. They're the winning power during the English Civil War, and everything comes to a shuddering halt. Can you believe it? Christmas actually banned. Yeah, no more, unfortunately. Anyway, we're going to end our video on that sad note, basically. But remember, we do actually have 2 more videos to go. Remember, we are not doing them daily after the 2nd of December, but what we do have for you is tomorrow on Tuesday, we've got the next stage. Is Christmas going to be resurrected? And then we'll eventually do our last video, which will bring us up to really modern times, modern Christmases. And hopefully you can look back and reminisce, look at how Christmas has had its ups and downs over the years. Personally, Christmas is its greatest when you get to the Middle Ages. On that note, stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.